The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials, named Jairus, came forward. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. "My daughter is at the point of death. Please, come lay your hands on her that she may get well and live." Jesus went off with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately, her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said, "You see how the crowd is pressing in upon us, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue's official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to Jairus, "Do not be afraid. Have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they entered at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, she is asleep." They ridiculed him, then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around, and they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this and that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
How are you with handling interruptions? I really don't do well. Oh, I've learned to fake it well enough on the outside. But trust me, you don't want to know what I'm feeling or what I'm thinking in those moments. The Gospel of Mark is filled with interruptions. The narrator often begins one story, interrupts it with a different story, and then comes back to complete the first story. There is is actually a 5-syllable word for that literary technique, but most of us just call it a sandwich. And today's gospel is a case in point. We begin with the story of Jairus intervening for his daughter. We're interrupted by the woman with a hemorrhage, and then we go back to Jairus' daughter. But today's gospel is about more than literary techniques. It's really about the hemorrhaging woman's action of interrupting and disrupting the unfolding events. Jairus. Jairus is a man of influence and power. He's described as a leader of the synagogue. That already tells us he's educated, he's wealthy, he probably has really good health insurance, a comfortable retirement plan, drives a highly rated SUV, has a nice home out in the suburbs, possibly in a gated community. Yet none of that insulates his daughter from becoming critically ill. I wonder about Jairus. I wonder if it was really hard for him to lower himself and ask Jesus for help. After all, as a leader of the synagogue, he had to know that Jesus was not viewed favorably by his fellow religious leaders. One also wonders if Jairus recognized his privileged place and knew he was using that to his advantage to kind of jump the line. Or was he completely blind to the privilege he enjoyed and the fact that because he was Jairus, he had immediate access to Jesus? Or maybe all of that's my judgment. Maybe Jairus is just a parent who's desperately to do anything to help his child. But it's very clear from the story that Jairus is used to giving orders and being in charge, because he asked Jesus for help, but then he tells Jesus how to do it. Come to my house, lay your hands on her and heal her. Very different from the centurion who we meet elsewhere in the gospel, who said, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come to my house. Just say the word. Not Jairus. Come to my house, lay hands on her. Now at this point, at least in the Hollywood version of this story, the music is swelling. And the camera steps back to pan the great parade now making its way to Jairus' house. But there's a wrinkle in the plot that's going to drive the director crazy. And the soaring orchestra music suddenly has to give way to the jarring, scratching sound of a needle being pulled across the record. There's a disturbance. And in contrast to Jairus, there is this unnamed, powerless, poor, and socially unconnected woman who has no one to intercede for her, as does Jairus' daughter. So she has to take matters into her own hands. And in desperation, she places herself next to Jesus there's a great irony here. Because we're used to Jesus being the disruptor. And now Jesus is going to be the one who's disrupted. The woman disrupts Jairus and his influence. Her faith disrupts her flow of blood. She disrupts a system that is totally stacked against her. Both Jairus' daughter and this woman need healing. And note that Jesus doesn't choose one or the other, nor does he try to pit them one against the other, as quite frankly we often do. Because the Jesus movement is defined by disruption and ironically also by unity and solidarity. Because rich and poor, liberal and conservative, male and female, educated and illiterate, believers, non-believers, those of all races and all of us stand in need of healing. Sin arises when we deny that need for healing within ourselves, and worse, when we fail to recognize it in one another. Grace arises when we admit our own need for healing and make way for the healing of others.